I'm actually going to sit in the corner here. Hope that doesn't mess up the camera.
Oh, just mix here.
Okay, because I don't have a PowerPoint, so maybe, how's that? Is that going to only sort of half my face? Not that I really matter.
I don't think you're in the picture.
I'm not? Okay. How's that?
We can move the camera. You don't have to move.
That's right.
Or the whole tripod.
Well, okay, so while this is getting settled, I want to just say thank you for inviting me, Mia. Wonderful to be here. And I definitely want to support everything that you're doing here in your collaborations, and so hopefully this is the beginning of an ongoing collaboration, and I stand ready to do whatever I can. I don't have a PowerPoint, so you'll have to just sort of listen to me for several minutes, and I promise not to speak too long. This is an interesting topic, and I think it's an important one, the idea of anthropology and human rights. And what I want to suggest, and I've written about this elsewhere, but I really want to reemphasize that, is that to talk about anthropology and human rights is not simply to have a conversation about the relationship between a discipline and this thing called human rights. And the reason I say that is because we look at both the history and the contemporary engagement or relationship between anthropology and human rights, it tends to stand in for larger questions. For example, about the role of politics, about the relationship between culture and human rights, about how we know about the basic questions of universality and human dignity. So whenever I'm with an interdisciplinary group, I try to emphasize that because I firmly believe that so in some ways anthropology it's good to think with, let's say. It's good to use anthropology to think through these questions. Okay, so what I want to do just in my brief remarks is I want to say a few things about where this encounter, where this relationship has been, where it is at now as far as I see it, and where I think it's going. And I must say, I want to just admit that I'm not as optimistic as Mia. Perhaps I'm tired. I've been with my children by myself for the last 2 weeks, so that's been difficult. So I'm sort of at the end of my rope, as we say. But leaving that perhaps much too personal bit aside, as I do live in Switzerland now, obviously, but I'm still an American citizen, so I can't help but follow the political situation that's going on. And so as I look at the development of the political process in the United States, the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of a candidate who evokes certain kinds of tendencies which are frightening, and it makes me a little bit more pessimistic about where we're headed beyond anthropology. And you'll hear me when I come back to talk about where it's going. You'll hear a whole laundry list of very depressing things, and so unfortunately I don't have a solution to that. So okay. So anthropology and human rights. I think the first thing that I want to say, and this is a disciplinary question, and I've struggled with this myself, again, as an American, is that how do we talk about anthropology, as such? There are different anthropological traditions, different histories. And I must say that I struggle myself to, in a sense, grasp and understand the full scope of these different kinds of traditions. Now, it's true that the American Anthropological Association has a particular history with human rights. And it's not the only one, but when I was working on an earlier book on this history, I wanted to be able to find the equivalent histories in the different national traditions, and they simply weren't there. So in some ways, the very early engagement of the American Anthropological Association was really one of the first, or the only as far as we know. But yet I would love to hear alternative accounts if any of you are coming from other traditions. And of course now I'm getting involved much more with the Swiss Ethnological Society. Here I'm on the executive board, and we're organizing, in fact, the meetings next year in Lausanne. And so I guess I should know what the history there is with the Swiss Ethnology Society, but I don't have an answer. But I think that's one of the, and maybe you could say something about Finnish anthropology when we talk about that. But I just want to foreground that, because when we talk about the American this and the American that, I want to make sure that I sort of say that I'm sensitive to that as a regional question. Another thing about this topic is it's very much an ideological. It's riven with ideological dimensions. It's very difficult to talk about this history without confronting the ideological dimensions. And what I mean is that when people read this history, and I think this is probably true of the history of human rights more generally, they tend to read it in the way they want to see it. They tend to read it primarily in a sort of ex post facto, taking how people feel about human rights more recently and then reading the history to sort of fit into this an ideological narrative. And that's been one of the hardest things for me as a scholar, is to try to make my way through these different ideological positions, and of course to try and say I'm not immune from that fact as well. I must have my own ideological predispositions toward human rights that have maybe guided my rereading or my critical approach to the history of anthropology and human rights, which is very much part of the history of human rights more generally. And I've been involved, as Mia intimated, in a project that is in a way similar to Moyne's, in the sense that Moyne sort of in his last Utopia, because he's published about 12 books since the last Utopia, just in the last few years, but each one sort of revising the history, is that the idea there was to sort of shake up the way in which human rights was understood. And the book was published in 2010, but in some ways it's a book that is looking to a moment in the history of about the 1990s and the 2000s. In other words, it was a way to shake up the way in which human rights was understood at this kind of high point, this apotheosis, to borrow another anthropological concept, this liminal period, as Victor Turner talked about it, after the end of the Cold War, when anything seemed possible, and international and transnational human rights were expanding through NGOs, through international documents, through new forms of international law, and human rights was really on the ascendant. And so the last Utopia is in a way a reflection on that moment. And so I think in some ways he would write a different kind of rewriting, a different kind of history now that reflects the time we live in now. But my project was similar to Moyne's, but it was focused not in the 1970s, but it was focused in the 1940s. And why? Because this infamous, as you said, 1947 Statement on Human Rights has played such an outsized role in the history of human rights more generally. It is the first thing that Johannes Morsink writes about in his 1999 history of the writing of the Declaration of Human Rights, the minute by minute, almost second by second, definitive. It's like we only need one of those kind of books, that goes into the documents, and at 4:52 p.m. on, every single minute is documented in that history. He starts off with a reference to this statement. Marianne Glendon gives a certain prominence to the Statement on Human Rights that was published in 1947. And why? Because this statement stood as a principled, scientific critique, rejection in a way, of what was going to be published, ratified, or what was just going to be adopted a year later, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And the fact that it came from an anthropologist, or it appeared to come from actually the American Anthropological Association, was significant. Why? Because although for many contemporary anthropologists it's hard to imagine, in the 1940s and the 1930s and 40s, anthropology was seen as the undisputed repository of scientific knowledge about the world's cultural diversity. So the fact that the anthropologist said, no, this isn't going to work, seemed to be a significant moment. So the sort of following the history of that statement and the document and how it came about was how I got interested in a way in the history of human rights. And so I have in a way engaged in my own rewriting of that history. What I discovered is that that early period of the 1940s was actually very different than what we've imagined, including the role of the Anthropology Association, but actually much more interesting. And this is maybe something we can talk about later. I actually think that in looking to the future, if we go back to look at the debates that were taking place in 1946 and 1947, not at the United Nations, not in the Commission for Human Rights, but at UNESCO, in Paris, and in other places, you find an incredibly dynamic, rigorous, pluralistic kind of approach to it, to what was going to happen. And the reason why that period is important for me is because it takes place in what I'm in a new book I've coming out that's subtitled "A Prehistory of Human Rights." It takes place before. I think it's important that it takes place before December 10th, 1948, before the Universal Declaration was launched into the world. It was taking place at a time in which the UDHR didn't exist. Right? That's an interesting moment because people, regardless of what Moyne talks about, and I agree to a large extent with what he says, nevertheless, once you have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was sort of announced with the fanfare that it was announced with, even though it sort of, in a sense, died on the vine in the intervening years in many ways, nevertheless, that was an important moment. But in the months, and not quite so many years, but certainly in the months before, we have this, again, another kind of liminal period. After the end of World War II, the world is sort of in ashes in many ways, and so this notion of in a way doubling down, as a gambler would say, is doubling down on this kind of liberal Enlightenment model that's based on rights and it's anchored in human dignity, was for a lot of people at the time was absolutely impossible to imagine. And this is what my research has uncovered, is that most of what we would call today progressive intellectuals couldn't tolerate the idea of a declaration on human rights. Most of them were aligned in some form of communism or socialism, and they were on the kind of traditional left. And the notion that we would suddenly, at the end of World War II, which seemed to be just the absolute implosion of this modern world that had been sort of chugging along since the Industrial Revolution, the idea that instead of finally embracing what Marx and what the communist intellectuals were talking about, which was a totally different world order that was organized around a communal holding of the means of production and so on. The idea that we would double down on what looked like a French Declaration of the Rights of Man or an American Declaration of Independence was just, it was mind-blowing to people. They couldn't believe it, right? I mean, even though Marx and so on, even though from a classic Marxist standpoint, human rights doesn't really actually get much attention. There are just a few references, but it's clearly not a central feature of that particular approach to history. And this includes people who were actually involved in the writing of human rights. There were people, particularly British scholars, who were either members of the British Communist Party or were active in the union movement, and they just couldn't believe that was going to be the way the world was going to be made new, as Eleanor Roosevelt called it. So I think going back and looking at that prehistorical period is very interesting because you have these really live debates, and they're not taking place in the United Nations, as I said. They're taking place largely in UNESCO and a few other locations that I'm sure that we can talk about. Okay, so where has it been? Okay, so in general, I'm not going to say more about this, but I just want to say one thing about history. From my perspective, is why is history important? I mean, why is the history of human rights important in 2016? Why is this an ongoing question? And that is because, especially after the end of the Cold War, when you had this explosion in human rights, when human rights, as Richard Wilson talked about, became the only language of democratic transition. You have Maoists in Nepal who are talking about human rights. And I always joke, I mean, when Maoists are human rights liberals, you're living in a different world, And so clearly there was that moment throughout the 90s and maybe even into the 2000s in which you have human rights becoming a dominant discourse, a dominant language. The legal apparatuses are gaining force. Things like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, is starting to really bite. It's really starting to take effect in different kinds of countries. As Hadi England writes about in his book, Prisoners of Freedom, throughout much of Africa and Latin America, human rights became the replacement language, the replacement model to what had existed before, some of which had been coming from post-colonial discourses, some of which had been coming from international development. So again, we know that kind of ongoing contemporary process. But why was history important then, and why is history important now? Because when human rights is proposed in political movements in whatever capacity, it comes with a certain set of moral claims, and indeed set of ontological claims, set of truth claims that appear to transcend history, that appear to transcend politics, that are wrapped in the language of universality. That is, that all people are equal in human dignity. That's a central claim. That is the normative anchor of human rights. And if we're all the same, by virtue of this quality called human dignity, and then in a kind of axiomatic, axiological, geometric way, then there are things which are derived from that, and that means we're entitled to have certain things done to us, and we're entitled to have certain things not done to us, i.e. rights. I mean, that's basically the epistemology of human rights. But it claims to be true. It claims to be true in a kind of transcendent sense. And therefore, looking at the history of how this true claim was launched into the world is an important one, because it's centrally a question of legitimacy. If that claim, if that truth claim is not true in the way it claims to be, in this universal sense, then human rights becomes just another idea that emerged at a moment in time in history, identified as the 1947 statement claim, argued, as Herskovits argued, associated with dominant Western powers, that was going to be part of a new emerging international system that was going to perhaps trample on the alternatives that were found around the world. So the history, going back and revisiting the history and envisioning that is an important one. I'm not a political philosopher, although I've been in enough conferences which has been dominated by political philosophers. That's the other group that was part of the story beyond the international lawyers, is that political philosophers, political theorists have done a lot of interesting work, and they don't worry about politics, they don't worry about reality, they don't worry about what's out there. It's very much an intense, rigorous discussion of something like the truth claim of human rights and where does it derive from, and how it relates to other philosophies that have their other kinds of origins, whether it's libertarian or communitarian or whatever. And that's an interesting way of approaching it and kind of going at it. But we anthropologists and others and historians are looking at it in a different kind of way. But that's the point I want to make about history, is that it's fundamentally a question of legitimacy. Because as soon as you let go of the claim of universality, the whole idea of human rights changes fundamentally. Then it becomes a real question of where the idea came from and whose interests are at stake and so on. And that is a difficult inquiry, because it leads down into the world of 1947, which was still largely a colonial world. I think there were only 46, 45 countries in the initial United Nations. I mean, think about the world in 1948. I mean, Africa, and that's interesting, who participated in the process. But the world was a very different kind of world then, and that was the world in which this transcendent idea, from which this transcendent idea emerged. Okay, so as I said, I've written about the UNESCO process, but I've just finished something here, so I want to just, for those of you who are kind of nerds or geeks or specialists in this area, or you've seen this, maybe this is for Mia, is that I want to modify something I wrote about in Surrendering to Utopia, which is that it's clear that this statement on human rights, which was published in the 1947 American Anthropologist, with a note appended below it, that it was submitted to the Commission on Human Rights at the United Nations by the Executive Committee of the American Anthropological Association, and that was the beginning of all the problems, because then it appeared that it was a kind of statement from anthropology, or at least American anthropology, and so on. And then that's why you get this history, this ideological history that says that anthropologists did this thing, they fought against human rights in 1947, and they've been embarrassed ever since. That's Karen Ingalls, for example, article from the 1990s. And that in a way, anthropologists have been trying to make amends for this egregious act for all of the subsequent years. So so I found out, first of all, that was not true, that the American Anthropological Association was not asked to produce a statement. But what I wrote is that Melville Herskovits, who actually wrote the statement, he was approached to write this by UNESCO. I have now subsequently found out that even that's not true. That in fact Herskovits was not asked by anybody connected to the process at UNESCO, and that in the deliberations in UNESCO over who should contribute to this survey that they wanted to have be part of what became the UDHR, nobody talked about anthropologists. Julian Huxley, who was the Director General, and his right-hand man, Jacques Havet, who was a student of Sartre and a mid-20s French philosopher, Normalian, from that elite line of French intellectual life. Those two were the ones who sort of did the UNESCO process, but they didn't talk about anthropology, which is interesting, right? It was, for them, who should be part of the process, it was clear, it was philosophers. If you want somebody to tell you about human rights, you need to have philosophers be part of that. So that's one thing which will be coming out in it, and something, a modification about, just in case you're interested. So Herskovits was asked, but he was asked by an American, by a dean of humanities at the University of Chicago called Richard McKeon. He was asked, McKeon was basically given the task to find a bunch of Americans to be part of the process. And so he produced a big long list, and Herskovits was on McEwen's list. And because they were both in Chicago, Herskovits was a professor at Northwestern at the time. That's how that happened. So it was totally random that Herskovits did this. It was totally, and it had nothing to do with the American Anthropological Association, except for the fact that he was a member of the association. The statement was not voted on by the members, and a statement was never sent to the Commission on Human Rights, because none of those statements were sent to the Commission on Human Rights. They came back to UNESCO. Okay, and then the second thing I want to add about this history is I've gone back recently and looked at as Mia was saying, in 1999, a group of activists decided, well, look, it doesn't matter whether it was anthropologist or Herskovits or whatever, but the Anthropology Association is going to take a firm step and definitively reject the 1947 statement and re-establish anthropology in a totally different posture toward human rights. And that's what they did in their 1999 declaration, worded to mimic the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Declaration on Anthropology and Human Rights, which you can find at the website of the American Anthropological Association. That was put to a vote of the members, and it was overwhelmingly supported in 1999. But what does this declaration do? This declaration says that not only do anthropologists support human rights, but anthropologists have an ethical obligation to use anthropological research and the unique ways and means of anthropology to enlarge the definition of human rights beyond what is written in international law. And they say, for example, and they give one prescriptive right. They say, anthropologists, based on our research, we can say that all human beings have a right, not to culture, which you would think they would say something like that. They say a right to the capacity for culture. The capacity for culture. In other words, the capacity to live your life within whatever terms are unique and to your place and time. And so what I've recently, I didn't really give that much thought until recently, and what I believe is that is ultimately fails as a first kind of anthropological attempt to write international law. Basically, it is a way to avoid the difficult questions of culture itself. When certain kinds of practices and beliefs present themselves in a way that seem to violate some human right, what happens then? Who wins? Well, if you have a right to culture, that is what is a right to culture except for the beliefs and a right to the beliefs and practices that are, that are important to you? Then there would seem to be, at least in certain cases, as the lawyers say, a kind of conflict of laws type of situation, a kind of time where there's going to be a conflict there. And who wins? Well, that's hard to say. But if you have a right to only a capacity for culture, it inserts an initial step, which I think was a weak attempt to put a kind of, to avoid the inevitable question. So that's my current thinking about the 1999 Declaration, and I think we're not there yet, as Mia said. So I think for those people who are interested in sort of taking up international law through anthropology, I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. Okay, how am I doing? How are we doing on time?
20 past 4, so what do you say?
Okay, maybe 5 more minutes. 10 more minutes, is that okay? Okay. So let me just say that was kind of where we were. Now where it's at. Where it's at point is, as Mia said, needs to be picked apart, and I'm not going to go, I think Mia already very, very nicely discussed that period in the 1990s, that early period where you have anthropologists getting involved as activists, and you can read about that. But what I'd like to say is, from my perspective, there are four, I think, areas or domains in which anthropologists have contributed the most to our understanding of human rights, and the broader understanding of human rights, looking at it from the present perspective. And the first has to do with human rights networks. Now, you know, the political scientists, Seeking and that group of political scientists, you know, they were really the ones who gave, from a political science perspective, our sense of what they call the power of human rights and human activists without borders. And there was a sense there, again, writing from the 1990s, in that liminal period of hope and optimism, that it looked like these NGOs and the networks were going to be the curious grapevine, which Eleanor Roosevelt mentioned. So if you remember in the 1948 Foreign Affairs article, that Foreign Affairs interview that appeared as an article that Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chair of the commission, as you know, on human rights, they asked her, well, what do you think about this thing that you've just done, this Universal Declaration? It's a really interesting interview, because she says, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, she says, nothing's going to happen for a long time. We look at the world. Already the Cold War you could already tell even then. I mean, 1949 hadn't happened, the Berlin airlift hadn't happened, but there was, I think, there was a sense of a kind of, it was a long-term project, that nothing was going to happen right away. But she says at some point, what she calls a curious grapevine, you know, a vine, a plant, is going to grow, and it's going to take the idea of human rights over the walls where states are not so interested to have it, I think is a direct quote. And in fact, that happened. It just took a long time. It took decades. It happened through NGOs and so on. And so there was a kind of utopian sense that these networks, these human rights networks, were a new form of governance, a new form of politics, a new form of law. That it was happening in a kind of post-Westphalian transnational space. And yet, I think the deep anthropology of these networks has given us a much more complicated picture of human rights networks and what they do and what they don't do, what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. And I think also this work is also useful for thinking about networks more generally on the global landscape. Mia mentioned some of the important works in this area, but particularly the more recent research. For example, I'm thinking of Winifred Tate's study of human rights networks in Colombia. You know, what emerges from that is a sense that networks can be co-opted by the bad guys as much as they are vehicles for, you know, empowerment for the victims of violations. Part of it has to do with the fact that as a form of governance, networks are obviously that you have these often international, transnational elites with their national partners operating in sometimes shadowy financial circumstances in a non-accountable way, as we understand it from democratic theory. And so there are certain aspects about networks which are interesting and complicated. And I think that's one of the main contributions of the contemporary anthropology of human rights. A second area is what I call moral creativity. And here, I think what the anthropology of human rights has shown by doing the kind of traditional anthropology, which is ethnographic research. So you're spending periods of time with people, asking questions, observing, you know, in a way that's not just flying in and doing survey research and flying out, but it's based in an attempt to get close, an attempt to capture what Malinowski called the hold that life has for people, you know, which is the stereotype of going native, which is, you know, the anthropologist with the pith helmet, and, you know, which has been lampooned for many generations. But there was something behind that. It was the notion of trying to see the world from the inside out. As impossible as that is ultimately, it's a part of the epistemology. And that research has been done on these during this period of explosion. And what you find is that people, it gives us an amazing database of how people grapple with these claims, these claims of human rights, and how it changes the way in which they operate in a broader normative universe. And here I'm thinking of social theory by people like Bourdieu and the practice theorist So this is an area of anthropology which has really added, I think, to our understanding of social practice in a very interesting way. And again, as always, it's complicated. It's not a sense of, the message here, if you're an activist, if you're an international lawyer, is not that when people encounter human rights, they become much more empowered. They start to focus on themselves as individuals. They leave the chains of culture behind and are ready to change the world. It is a context of creative practice, but it is a practice with an unintended, with an uncertain outcome. I think of Shannon Speed's work here on the Juntas de Buen Gobierno in Mexico during the time of the Zapatista rebellion, and she did this deep ethnographic work, and she shows how when the indigenous Zapatista activists were basically, in a sense, forced to use human rights to articulate their claims, even though they'd spent their whole decades in a similar movement articulating those claims within a series of other kinds of discourses, whether it was some kind of leftist or post-colonial rhetoric. You find that they work with, almost like a palette, like a painter, they work with the idea of human rights, but in her analysis, they in a sense change it so far that we don't recognize it anymore. In other words, they come up with an organic, in a sense, theory of human rights, which wouldn't be recognizable to international lawyers. It's a theory which is, in a kind of somewhat well-known phrase, it's a theory in which human rights exist in their exercise. That's how they see it. So human rights is not something that's immanent. It's not something that's part of us as humans in the kind of Kantian sense. It is something which is only realized in a temporary way when it actually has force in the world, whether it's against the state or in land claims. And so it's a sort of a phenomenological, we might say, theory of human rights, but one which is, and it's also one from the Zapatista perspective, where they say that we Zapatistas have our own human rights that exist when we exercise them. So they're not thinking of people in Papua New Guinea or women in New York or people in Geneva. They're not seeing the human in human rights. It's a very local, organic, rooted theory of human rights. Now, what do we do with that? That would be interesting to think about. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to leave. I had a couple more things, but I want to get to the future because I want to get to the pessimistic part. Okay, so this is, and I'm glad that we didn't plan our presentation, so about the future of human rights. But so the future of anthropology and human rights is obviously also a question of the future of human rights, because anthropology is going to follow, hopefully, in different kinds of ways, the trajectory of human rights in the coming years. So how do I see this? Okay, so. And again, I'm going to try and not have Donald Trump's, orange hair in my vision as I'm trying to. So this might be changing even in the next year. So I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen? But so the first thing is that I would say is, and this is something which has been out there in different places, is that I look at the current moment as a period after the end. It's hard to say this without kind of getting confused, but after the end of the post-Cold War. So that post-Cold War period from, say, 1989, 1990, and I don't want to, it's not like there's a date, it's on this date, no, that's not interesting to me, but there was this period of time which everybody recognizes. And here I come back to Victor Turner, this moment of liminality. Now, what does liminality mean? Here we go, classic anthropological concept. Liminal periods are those periods in which hierarchy, inequality, status are temporarily suspended. So people who come from various different backgrounds and so on are suddenly sort of thrown together. There's a kind of equality in which the hierarchies, the structures of power are suspended. Okay? And that's a moment in which new things are possible. But very interestingly, nothing is ever created from nothing, right? So it's always, what's going to come after a period of liminality is always there in that liminal moment, reminding people that not everything is possible. And I think it's interesting to think about that moment of the Cold War. What were those things, if you look back in 1992, 93, 94, sort of reminding us that not everything is possible? I think many of those things would be economic questions, and inequality and structures of capitalism and so on. But there was a period, but all periods of liminality have to end. In fact, those periods of of limitless possibility only serve as, in a sense, temporary moments in between the hierarchy of before and the slightly modified hierarchy and structure and of after. So so what I'm arguing is that moment of limitless possibility has ended, and that we are now in the period after the end of the post-Cold War. And so what's interesting for us as scholars, as anthropologists, is to do our best to try and describe what that current moment is. What are the new lines of hierarchy, or the modified lines of hierarchy and structure? That is, those things which make it clear that it's very difficult to do anything different, to do anything new. I mean, that's the kind of, maybe society itself serves that function. So that's I think the first thing I would say about the future of anthropology, the anthropology of human rights, is it's going to be going forward. I mean, people ask me, like, when would you mark that time? The end of the Cold War is kind of easier. What about the end of the post-Cold War? And one thing I like to think about is that I mean, there's the financial meltdown. There's many things you can talk about. But from a human rights perspective, some people don't realize this, but every year there is Human Rights Day. December 10th of each year is Human Rights Day. And I think it's now the Human Rights Council announces a theme for that year. And I think as late as 2010, or 9 or 10, now why is that important? That was at the moment when the so-called Arab Spring was kicking off. And it was clear this was the culmination of the human rights revolution. I mean, human rights is sweeping the Middle East. Dictatorial, regimes are falling left and right. People are communicating through the internet, talking to Croatian activists, and you have this. It's happened. This is the culmination, the end of history, right? And then what happened? Well, it turned out that it wasn't what we thought. But that year, so let's call, I think it's 2010. The theme was human rights with an exclamation point. It was like just screaming off the page. Yeah, let's celebrate. And then by the very next year, 2011, it was like working for your human rights. And it was just focused on like the bureaucracy. Let's celebrate the bureaucracy. Literal, I think even bureaucracy is mentioned. The hardworking, members of the, and it's like, I mean, you just wanted to cry. You wanted to feel so sorry for this. But so, I don't know, so maybe just we could play with 2010 as the end of the post-Cold War, who knows? But anyway, but leaving that aside, so we're in this moment, so I think that's going to be the task for us now, is to try and characterize this moment and what it means and how and what are the structures and what do they mean for social change and so on. The second thing I think about the current and the future of human rights and anthropology has to do with culture. For all of the 1990s, people were saying culture is dead. Nobody wants to talk about culture anymore. There was that book in 2001 that was mentioned, Culture and Rights, which was an important volume in this debate. But it was work that was based on research really in the 1990s. And nobody, anthropologists who in a way gave the world, arguably in the 19th century, German anthropologists and others sort of launched the Kultur, the notion of Kultur onto the world, that notion of the Volksgeist, the distinct beliefs and practices which are connected to people, problematically maybe at the level of the blood, or at the level of the biology. By the 1990s, everybody was running away from culture as fast as we could go. And I just recently finished something where I went back and looked at the so-called Asian values debate. You remember that? This was in the 1990s, following after Tiananmen, which I think was 1989. So there's a real criticism of China and what the killing of over 1,000 human rights and democracy activists in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and there was a real critique of that, which then sort of spread out and went to Singapore, and it became a kind of critique. But then the Chinese, the Singaporean, the Malaysian diplomats pushed back, and they said, wait a second, you can't criticize us for not upholding human rights, because that's a Western imposition, that's a form of colonialism. We have a unique Asian culture which values community and values the collective over the individual, and you can't push that upon us. And I went back and looked at the debate, in other words, the response to the Asian values debate. People at Human Rights Watch and a lot of intellectuals got involved in that, and there were editions of journals that were published. And one of the things which you see in like 1993 and 94 is that scholars, pro-human rights scholars, were absolutely convinced that culture was dead or it was dying, and that was, in a sense, that argument from the diplomats from East Asia and Southeast Asia was sort of the final gasp of this idea that was dying. Well, from looking from the perspective of the present, I would say, culture is dead. Long live culture. In other words, the use of culture as a device, as a rhetoric, the problems of culture, the counterposition of culture and international law, or culture and this, that is an ongoing debate. It never died. It never left. It maybe did for cosmopolitan intellectuals who don't want to think about it, who maybe themselves don't feel connected to a place, like most people in the world do. But maybe a lot of people living right here in this room. I mean, we have to be careful. For the sort of cosmopolitan intellectual, we have to be able to look out and, in a sense, feel. I like the quote from feel the idea, feel the feeling of culture. How does culture feel to people? To belong to something. And so it's not to mean that we want to sort of re-embrace this old-fashioned notion of culture as a reified set of practices which never change. But I think that that's going to be something which will continue to be part of our discussion. I'm really going to quickly just end. I apologize for going over my time. I think as Thomas Piketty has and others have recently talked about, I think the problem of global inequality is going to continue to be